Evening. A crowded commercial flight prepares for takeoff. Passengers are restless, slamming luggage into overhead bins. In row 24, a 42-year-old man in a simple jacket helps his young daughter buckle her seatbelt. She accidentally spills her water. A man in the seat ahead groans loudly. Some people shouldn't bring kids on late flights. A few others snicker. The father just smiles at his daughter and wipes the floor. 20 minutes into the flight, the intercom crackles. The voice is urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, is there a licensed pilot on board who can assist the crew?" The cabin goes dead silent. No one is moving. Daniel Carter was a man who lived his life in a lower altitude than he was used to. At 42, his face carried the subtle, etched lines of a life lived under high pressure, both in the sky and on the ground. For 15 years, Daniel had been a long-haul international captain for a major carrier, crossing oceans while the world slept. He was a master of the heavy jets, a man who felt more comfortable at 38,000 feet than he did on a sidewalk. But today, he wasn't wearing the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders. He wasn't the authority figure in the crisp white shirt. He was wearing a faded cotton jacket and carrying a tattered backpack. He was just another passenger in economy, squeezed into seat 24B between a window and a restless traveler. Daniel's life had changed fundamentally 3 years ago. When his wife Sarah passed away after a brave, quiet battle with illness, the glamour of the international circuit vanished instantly. The adrenaline of the takeoff and the serenity of the star-filled cockpit no longer held any appeal. He couldn't be in Tokyo or Dubai while his daughter was having nightmares in a quiet house in London. He had made a choice that many in his industry called career suicide. He resigned from his prestigious position and took a job as a senior flight instructor at a small regional training center. It was a massive step down in pay and status, but a vital step up in purpose. He wanted to be the father who was there for every breakfast, every school play, and every scraped knee. His daughter Emily was 10 years old and shared her father's quiet, observant nature. She loved airplanes, but more than that, she loved the way her dad could look at a cloud and tell her exactly what kind of wind was hiding inside it. They were flying today to visit family and spend a weekend at the National Aviation Museum, a long-promised pilgrimage for a girl who dreamed of one day touching the stars herself. The atmosphere on the flight was suffocating. It was a late-night departure, delayed by technical issues at the gate, and the cabin was packed with exhausted business travelers and irritable tourists. People were short-tempered, looking for any excuse to vent their frustration. When Emily had accidentally knocked her water bottle over during the boarding process, the reaction from the surrounding passengers had been disproportionately harsh. "Great! A wet floor and a crying kid," the man in 23A muttered, turning around to glare at them. Just what this flight needed. Why do people even bring children on these red-eyes? A woman across the aisle rolled her eyes, sighing as she pointedly adjusted her expensive, noise-canceling headphones. They saw a struggling single dad who seemed out of his depth. They saw a man who didn't look like he belonged in their world of tight schedules and high-value time. They didn't see the man who had once landed a disabled Boeing 777 in a 50-knot crosswind during a typhoon in the South China Sea. Daniel didn't defend himself. He didn't offer a rebuttal or tell them he had logged 20,000 hours in the air. He simply looked at Emily, placed a steady, warm hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "It's okay, pal. Mistakes are just data points. Let's just clean it up and move on. The plane doesn't care about the water, and neither should we." He was a master of emotional turbulence. He knew that reacting to the small-mindedness of strangers was a waste of energy he needed for his daughter. He focused entirely on making sure Emily felt safe and comfortable. As the plane finally taxied toward the runway, Daniel didn't look at the safety card. He listened. He listened to the pitch of the engines as they moved into the takeoff roll. He felt the subtle vibration of the landing gear through the floorboards. He knew exactly which flap setting the pilot was using just by the sound of the wind resistance. To everyone else, it was just background noise. To Daniel, it was a conversation he had been having with machines his entire life. They took off into the pitch-black sky, the city lights fading into a beautiful, blurred tapestry of gold and silver. Emily leaned her head against his arm, watching the red navigation light on the wingtip blink against the clouds. For a few minutes, the cabin was quiet, settled by the steady hum of the cruise altitude. But the peace was about to be shattered by a reality that none of the important people in the front rows were prepared for. The flight reached 35,000 feet. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, and the flight attendants began the rhythmic, metal-clinking dance of the beverage service. Daniel was showing Emily how to read a star map on his tablet, pointing out Orion's belt when he felt it. It wasn't a bump of common turbulence. It was a subtle, high-frequency shudder that traveled through the airframe, a vibration that spoke of mechanical stress. It lasted for only 3 seconds, but Daniel's internal sensors, the ones that had been calibrated over decades of flight, screamed in his mind. He looked out the window. The engine housing was steady, but the pitch of the turbine had shifted by a fraction of a decibel. It was an overspeed on the secondary bleed air valve. A few minutes later, the aircraft tilted slightly to the left. It was a minor correction, something a normal passenger would assume was just a routine route change directed by air traffic control. But Daniel noticed the lack of a corresponding rudder movement. The autopilot had been disconnected. The plane was being flown manually, and the hand on the yoke was slightly unsteady, overcorrecting the bank. He glanced toward the front of the plane. He saw the lead flight attendant, a woman named Sarah, hurry toward the cockpit. She didn't look panicked to the untrained eye, but she was moving with a rigid, urgent speed. She knocked on the armored door, entered the code, and vanished inside. She didn't come out. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the lead flight attendant," the voice said. It was calm, professional, but there was an underlying tremor, a micro-fracture in the tone that only another crew member could detect. "If there is a licensed commercial pilot on board, could you please identify yourself to a member of the cabin crew immediately? Please stay in your seats. This is a precautionary request. I repeat, any licensed pilot, please ring your call bell." The cabin went dead silent. The hum of the engine suddenly sounded much louder, more menacing. The man in 23A, who had been mocking Daniel earlier, froze with a plastic cup halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. The woman with the headphones pulled them off, her face turning a ghostly shade of white as the reality of the request sank in. The unimportant background noise of the flight had suddenly become the only thing that mattered in the universe. Daniel sat perfectly still. His mind was already running through the diagnostic checklist. If they were asking for a pilot, the situation was dire. In modern aviation, with 2 highly trained pilots, you never ask the cabin for help unless one is completely incapacitated and the other is overwhelmed. Emily looked up at him, her grip tightening on his hand until it hurt. "Dad, what does that mean? Why do they need help? Is the plane breaking?" Daniel squeezed her hand back, his voice a low, steady anchor in the rising sea of frantic whispers. "It means one of the pilots isn't feeling well, Emily. The plane is strong, but the captain needs an extra set of hands to help with the radios. It's just like when we practice in the simulator. Stay calm. Everything is under control." He waited for 10 seconds. He didn't want to be the guy who jumped up to play hero if there was an active-duty, current-line pilot sitting in first class. He knew the protocol. He waited for another 5 seconds. No one stood up. No one rang a bell. The cabin was a vacuum of paralyzed souls. The man in front of them turned around, his face glistening with sweat. "Does anyone know what's happening? Is the pilot dead? Are we going to crash?" "Stay calm, sir," Daniel said. His voice was no longer the soft, patient voice of a dad. It was the resonant, commanding baritone of a captain. It was a frequency that demanded and received immediate obedience. Daniel pressed the attendant call button. Within seconds, a junior flight attendant hurried to their row, her hands shaking as she held her mobile device. She looked at Daniel's simple jacket and the little girl beside him, her brain clearly struggling to match the visual with the need. "I'm a licensed pilot," Daniel said quietly, ensuring his voice didn't carry to the rest of the panicked passengers. "I am current on the 737 and the A32O series. I'm a senior instructor. I have my credentials on my phone. How can I help?" The attendant blinked, looking at his calm, steady eyes. In that moment, she didn't see an ordinary dad. She saw a lifeline. "Please follow me, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking. Daniel turned to Emily, kneeling as much as the cramped space allowed. I'm going to go help them for a little bit, okay? I want you to stay right here, keep your seatbelt fastened, and finish your drawing of the museum. I'll be right back, I promise. Be careful, Dad, Emily said, her voice small but remarkably brave. Daniel stood up. As he walked down the narrow aisle, the passengers watched him in a heavy, expectant silence. The man in 23A stared at Daniel's scuffed shoes as he passed, his mouth hanging open. The woman with the headphones watched him with wide, pleading eyes. Daniel wasn't walking like a passenger anymore. He was moving with the purposeful, heavy stride of a man who was returning to his post. He reached the cockpit door. The code was entered, and the world of row 24 vanished behind him. The cockpit was a cramped, glowing world of blue and amber flight displays. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy metallic scent of recycled air. As Daniel stepped inside, the situation was immediately and brutally clear. The first officer was slumped in his seat, his face a sickly shade of gray, his breathing ragged. Sarah, the lead attendant, was kneeling beside him, holding an emergency oxygen mask to his face. The captain, a man in his late 50s named Miller, was gripped by a focused, white-knuckled intensity. He was flying the aircraft manually while trying to manage the navigation and the radio simultaneously. He was task-saturated, his eyes darting across the screens as the plane bucked in the worsening weather. "Captain Miller," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the mechanical noise of the cockpit. "Daniel Carter. I'm a senior flight instructor. I've got 20,000 hours, 10 of them on this specific airframe. Tell me what you need." Miller didn't look back. He couldn't afford to take his eyes off the primary flight display. "Carter, thank God. My FO just had a major cardiovascular event. Blood pressure bottomed out. I need you in the right seat. Now. I need you to handle the radios and run the landing checklist. We're diverting to Salt Lake City. The weather is closing in, and I've got a hydraulic fluctuation in System B." Daniel didn't hesitate for a microsecond. He slipped into the first officer's seat, his hands moving instinctively over the controls he hadn't touched in a real cockpit for 3 years. It was like a dormant part of his brain had been struck by lightning. The muscle memory was perfect. Every switch, every dial, every procedure felt like a language he had never stopped speaking. "I have the radios," Daniel stated, his voice a calm, rhythmic pulse. He keyed the mic. "Salt Lake Center, this is Skyway 442. We have a medical emergency on board. Requesting priority descent and direct routing to runway 16 left. We have an incapacitated crew member and a partial hydraulic failure in System B. Declaring an emergency." The calm in Daniel's voice acted like a sedative on the entire operation. On the ground, the controllers responded instantly, clearing the sky for the heavy jet. Inside the cockpit, Daniel began to work the overhead panels with the speed of a virtuoso. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He spoke with the rhythmic precision of a man who had seen everything the sky could throw at him, from engine fires to bird strikes. For the next 45 minutes, Daniel was the bridge between the aircraft and the ground. He managed the descent profile, monitored the failing hydraulic pressure, the cause of the vibration he had felt earlier, and guided Captain Miller through the complex emergency checklist. "Trim is pulling left, Captain," Daniel noted, his eyes scanning the hydraulic gauges. "I'll compensate on the secondary trim wheel. Watch your airspeed on the final turn. The spoilers might be sluggish with the low pressure." Inside the cockpit, there were no ordinary dads. There were only 2 professionals navigating 100 tons of metal through a dark, turbulent sky. Daniel was reading the checklists with a clarity that made the captain's breathing slow down. He was predicting the aircraft's needs before the captain could even verbalize them. "You're a hell of an instructor, Carter," Miller grunted as they broke through the clouds and the runway lights of Salt Lake City appeared like a string of pearls in the rain. "Where have you been hiding?" "Row 24, Daniel replied with a faint, tired smile. "Watching my daughter draw a picture of a vintage prop plane." The landing was a masterpiece of cooperation. Despite the gusting crosswind and the mechanical vibration from the hydraulic leak, the heavy jet touched the tarmac with a smooth, professional thud. The thrust reversers roared, the brakes gripped with a high-pitched squeal, and the aircraft slowed to a safe taxi speed. Daniel stayed in the seat, assisting with the shutdown procedures until the emergency medical teams had boarded the plane and evacuated the first officer. Only then did he exhale. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had been wiping spilled water and comforting a 10-year-old 20 minutes ago. They were perfectly steady. "Thank you, Daniel," Captain Miller said, turning in his seat to shake Daniel's hand with a grip that said more than any words could. "I couldn't have managed the divert, the manual trim, and the radio alone in this weather. You saved more than just a schedule tonight. You saved every soul on this plane." "It was an honor, Captain," Daniel replied. He slipped out of the cockpit, his work done. As he stepped back into the cabin, the atmosphere was completely transformed. The Ice Queen across the aisle stood up and began to clap. Then another person stood, then another. Daniel walked through a gauntlet of standing ovations. The people who had looked at him with pity, annoyance, or judgment were now looking at him with a mixture of awe and profound, tearful gratitude. The man in 23A, the one who had complained about Emily, stood up and blocked Daniel's path for a second. "Sir," the man said, his voice shaky and filled with a burning, genuine shame. I want to apologize. I had no idea who you were. I was incredibly rude to you and your daughter. I'm so sorry." Daniel stopped. He looked at the man, then past him to where Emily was waiting, standing on her seat with a wide, beaming smile that lit up the entire row. "It's okay, sir," Daniel said calmly. "Travel days are stressful for everyone. Just remember that the most important person on the plane isn't always the one making the most noise. Sometimes they're just the ones waiting for the right moment to help." He reached Emily's row and she jumped into his arms, hugging him so tight he almost lost his balance. "Did you help them, Dad?" she whispered into his ear. Daniel smiled, kissing the top of her head. "The captain did all the hard work, pal. I just helped him read the map and talk to the people on the ground." As they waited to deplane, the cabin was no longer a place of strangers and cold judgment. It was a place of connection and shared humanity. People were talking to each other, sharing their relief, and looking at the single dad with a level of respect that no uniform could ever provide. Daniel had proven that a hero isn't a title you wear. It's a decision you make when the world asks for help. The deplaning process was slow, but for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't mind the wait. Every passenger who passed him offered a nod, a handshake, or a quiet, sincere, "Thank you." The man in 23A stayed behind, waiting until the aisle was completely clear to speak to Daniel one more time. "I'm Julian," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm a corporate lawyer. I spend my entire life judging people by their billable hours, their suits, and their titles. Tonight, you showed me how wrong I've been. Your daughter is lucky to have a father like you, not just because you're a pilot, but because you're a man of character." Daniel shook the hand firmly. "Thank you, Julian. We all have our roles. Tonight, mine just happened to be the one that was needed. Just remember to give people a little more room next time. You never know what's under the surface." As Daniel and Emily walked into the terminal, they were met by the airport manager and a small group of airline officials. They wanted to take them to a VIP lounge, to offer them free first-class flights for life, to set up a press conference with the local news. Daniel politely but firmly declined it all. "I'm just here for the museum," Daniel said with a tired, genuine grin. "And I think my daughter has had enough excitement for one night. We just want a quiet room and some sleep." They walked through the airport, two ordinary people in a sea of travelers. But the news had already traveled faster than the jet. The mystery pilot story was already breaking on social media. People were pointing at them as they passed. Daniel kept his head down, his focus entirely on Emily and her little backpack. They reached their rental car, and for the first time since the announcement, they were alone in the quiet. The rain was drumming a peaceful, rhythmic pulse on the roof of the car. "Dad," Emily asked, looking at her star map. "Yes, pal? Why didn't you tell them you were a pilot when we first got on? Why did you let that man be so mean to you about the water?" Daniel started the engine, the headlights illuminating the wet pavement. He took a moment to find the right words, the ones that would stick with her forever. "Because being a pilot is what I do, Emily. It's not who I am. I didn't need Julian to know I was a pilot to deserve his respect, and I didn't need to prove anything to him to feel good about myself. He looked at her, his eyes serious but warm in the dim dashboard light. True skill is like a quiet light, Emily. It doesn't need to shout to be seen. It doesn't need a uniform to be real. It just needs to be there when the room goes dark. If I had told him I was a pilot just to make him shut up, I would have been acting out of pride. But by waiting until I was truly needed, I was acting out of duty. There's a big difference. One is for your ego, the other is for the world. Emily nodded, absorbing the lesson. So you stayed quiet to stay humble? I stayed quiet because I was there to be your dad, Daniel corrected her. And being your dad is a lot more important than being a captain with 4 stripes. The stripes come and go. Being a father is forever. They drove toward their hotel, the city lights reflecting in the puddles like diamonds. Daniel felt a profound, heavy sense of peace. He had spent years chasing the adrenaline of the sky, the prestige of the international routes, and the validation of the industry. But tonight he realized that the greatest flight he had ever taken was the one where he stayed on the ground long enough to see his daughter truly see him. He wasn't the hero of Flight 442 to her. He was just dad. And as they pulled into the hotel parking lot, Daniel realized that was the only title that would ever truly matter in the final lap of his life. He had landed the plane, but more importantly, he had landed his soul. The next morning, the sun was shining with an aggressive brightness over the National Aviation Museum. The massive hangars were filled with the silent, majestic history of men and women who had dared to defy gravity. Emily ran from display to display, her excitement renewed, pointing out the Spitfires and the Concorde. They stopped in front of a vintage commercial jet, a gleaming silver bird from another era. A group of school children were being led by a tour guide who was explaining the terrifying complexity of the cockpit. It takes years of grueling training to master these machines, the guide said, his voice echoing in the hangar. You have to be the smartest, bravest person in the room to handle a crisis. Emily looked at her father, then back at the jet. She tugged on Daniel's hand, whispering, Can I be a pilot someday, Dad? A real one? Even if I'm not the loudest person? Daniel knelt down beside her, the same way he had in row 24. Of course you can, Emily. You have the heart for it, and that's the most important part. But do I have to be the smartest person in the room? She asked, looking at the complex dials. Daniel smiled, ruffling her hair. No, you just have to be the person who is willing to listen when the room is silent. You have to be the person who stays calm when everyone else is shouting. That's what makes a real pilot. Not the speed and not the height. It's the stillness inside you. They spent the rest of the day lost in the world of flight. Daniel told her stories, not about his own heroics, but about the mechanics who worked in the rain, the navigators who trusted the stars when the systems failed, and the pilots who knew when to hand over the controls because they were tired. As they walked out of the museum, the sky was a deep, infinite blue. A jet roared overhead, its white contrail cutting a clean path through the clouds. Emily watched it until it disappeared over the horizon. I'm going to be a pilot, she promised, her voice firm, but I'm going to be a quiet one. Just like you, Dad. Daniel felt a thick lump in his throat. He realized that the spill at the beginning of the flight, the mockery of the passengers, and the crisis in the cockpit had all been part of a larger, beautiful lesson. He hadn't just saved a plane, he had shaped a soul. The story of the single dad on the plane wasn't a story about a hidden expert. It was a story about the power of restraint. It was a reminder that the people we judge most quickly, the ones who look ordinary or overwhelmed, are often the ones holding the world together while we complain about the weather. Daniel Carter drove his daughter home, the captain in him at peace, and the father in him triumphant. He didn't need the stripes on his sleeves to know he was flying high. He just needed the small, confident hand in his. Because real character isn't what you show the world when things are easy and the sky is clear. It's the person you become when the world goes dark and the captain asks for help. The wings of a pilot are made of silver and steel, but the wings of a man are made of the truth he doesn't need to tell. If you believe that real character shows itself when things go wrong, and that true expertise doesn't need to shout, Subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered someone's true skill when it mattered most? How did it change your perspective?